Hello, Legends of Vinyl. This is Tim Lawrence here, videoing from London to thank you for inducting me into your Hall of Fame. I'm honoured to have been thought of on this occasion, and also slightly amazed, to be honest, to be included amongst some of the likes of Earl Young and other pioneers of this culture that we now call disco. And I just really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for honouring me in this way. If I have made a contribution, I suppose it's primarily at this point through the writing of Love Saves the Day, a history of American dance music culture, 1970 to 79. It was a rather big piece of work, and it did take rather a long time to write, so I hope it's been worth it. I wrote it because I felt that there was a whole story to be told about the pioneers and protagonists who helped make this culture, who helped inspire the rise of DJ culture and what became its first primary associated sound of disco. At the time, when I started to write the book, there was nothing really out there that went much beyond the argument that disco amounted to Saturday Night Fever and Studio 54. It might be that Anthony Hayden's Guest, The Last Party, which came out in 1997, was the most detailed account of the era to date, but that account focused almost exclusively on Studio 54. And not atypically, Anthony Hayden Guest, in a book that was probably about 400 pages long, dedicated one sentence, not even one page, but one sentence, to the DJ at Studio 54, the esteemed and influential Richie Kazar. So entering into this book, I just felt that there was much more to be said about the culture. In fact, I'd started off to write a book about house music, and I was going to start my account in mid-1980s Chicago and New York. But it was early in the research process that Stephen Prescott and Joe Classell at Dance Tracks, where I was buying records every Friday night at the time, I was living in New York at the time, suggested that I speak to a guy called David Mancuso because even if he was somewhat unto himself and not that well known at the time, he was there at the very beginning and might be interesting to speak with. So I met up with David, and we had enjoyed a long 3-hour dinner in an East Village Italian restaurant. And quite frankly, during that conversation, I barely understood or followed a word that David said. There were just all of these references to these parties, to these DJs, to a whole spectrum of sound recordings, institutions such as the New York City Record Pool, which I'd never heard of before, and I thought of myself as someone who really knew a great deal about the history of dance culture. And so, bells started to kind of ring, and I thought, well, hang on a second, if I haven't heard of this, then maybe there's something more to be said about this. And by the time I got home that evening, there were about 10 messages on my answer machine from people that David knew, and people who had participated in the culture as well. And these were people who were ready to tell their story. And so I quickly came to realise that there was a whole unwritten history that focused on parties that often unfolded in downtown New York, involved DJs who weren't household names, records that hadn't been particularly written about before, which came before and inspired the things that in some ways culminated in disco's most commercial articulations, Studio 54 and Saturday Night Fever, but were just as important to understand and to describe and to analyse. And so I set about interviewing more than 100 people, gathering artwork, going through the archives, and trying to knit together what in some respects I think of as a community history. A history that describes how it was the passion of people to be together, to listen to music, to dance, to seek pleasure but also community at the same time, to find meaning in a world that was in some respects increasingly troubled. That became this story of Love Saves the Day, history of American dance music culture 1970 to 79. The idea of writing a house book eventually, I just kind of had to throw that out the window because it took me 500 pages and 180,000 words to get to the end of 1979. And at that point, looking at the backlash against disco that peaked in that year, but also looking at the way that the culture of DJ culture and dance music culture in many respects continued as if nothing had happened, especially in New York City, because why would people want to give up their way of life, a culture that they had helped build and a culture that they loved, just because of this backlash? So that, at the end of 1979, became a good point to end the account. And it's an account that, you know, I've continued to feel very passionate about, and it's a token of my admiration for the culture itself and the people who helped make this culture come about. So I thank you in turn for recognizing my own efforts. Again, I'm honored, I'm touched, I'm amazed. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.